Are alien reptile people really taking over our government? Some believers think that they are, and that these shape-shifting lizards are doing it on purpose to feed off of our confusion, chaos, and negative energy. Could there be any truth to that? Well, I'm a lawyer who spent nearly 20 years working in local government and philanthropy, and I'm here to show you what's actually going on in US government is just as bad, maybe worse. I've talked before about what I call Civic Word Salad, and this video is a guided tour through the worst of it. We may laugh at conspiracy theories, but when an 80-year-old public agency drops all traces of what it actually does from its name, that's a rebrand even a lizard person would admire. And the real danger? It's not aliens. It's a civic system so opaque, so tangled, and so contradictory, it may as well have come from another planet. All right, let's come back to Earth for a second. Before we go deeper, think about the public resources in your community, the ones you know you're paying for. The local school, maybe the parks department, the library. You know what they are, you can picture the building, and you know just what it's for. But now, think about a housing authority. Most communities in the US have one, but most people have no idea what they actually do. And when I worked at one, I'd often take calls from people that went something like, "Hi, my neighbor's piling up garbage and it's a real nuisance to the neighborhood, and you need to do something about it." And I'd say, "I'm sorry, sir, that's actually not us. You need to call code enforcement." And they'd say, "But you're the housing authority, right? You're the authority on housing." And I'd say, "Well, sir, you have a very good point." So what exactly are housing authorities anyway? Well, they mainly run these programs called Public Housing and Section 8, which both provide housing subsidies to low-income people. Let me just say that that's some people who are low income. These aren't entitlement programs, so at any given time in this country, we're serving about only 25% of the people who are actually eligible by way of the formulas, but I digress. Housing authorities were created by Congress in 1937 through the U.S. Housing Act, which told state legislatures that they could get some federal money for housing if they set up this specific type of local government agency to receive and manage that funding. So state governments passed enabling legislation in their state codes, each with their own twist on how they were governed and structured. And now we have about 4,000 of them across the country. They're generally classified as special purpose districts, which I've talked about in my other videos as being the largest and fastest growing category of local government unit types in the United States. But at the beginning, state and local leaders jumped at the chance to create housing authorities. This money allowed them to create alternatives to slum housing where children were growing up in dilapidated hovels with no proper sanitation, no furnaces, and no running water. And little known fact, these entities were actually hugely important to the World War II effort because it allowed state, federal, and local governments to work together to quickly inject housing at scale exactly where it was needed so that they could position civilian workers in places essential to wartime production. But how many people really know what they are, what they do, and what they cost? And that particular problem is only getting worse, especially when housing authorities decide to rebrand and drop housing authority from their name altogether. Who would ever guess that something named Inlivian isn't a new sci-fi movie about alien reptile people infiltrating local government? It's just the fancy new name for the housing authority of the city of Charlotte, originally established in 1939. And this kind of naming confusion isn't the exception, it's the rule. If you think the US has a system of local government, it doesn't. It has 50 different ones, each with their own rules, powers, labels, contradictions, and overlaps. It's the reason why we get these nonsense situations where a place like Bellevue, Washington, with 151,000 people is called a city and run by a mayor, but Amherst, New York, with 131,000 people is called a town and run by a town supervisor. The word city is almost meaningless. In New York, you become a city if the state legislature said so, but in Ohio, it's based on population. Hit 5,000, you're a city. Drop below that, you go back to being a village. In Washington, it's just paperwork. File under the right classification, you're a city, no matter what your size is. And then there's all the overlap to contend with. In Illinois, where there are over 6,000 local government units, some residents are taxed by 15 or more overlapping governments, including special districts just for mosquitoes, cemeteries, and street lighting. In Michigan, you might live in a village inside a township, both of which tax you, and still rely on the county for schools, roads, sewers, layered on top. In some places, like San Francisco, the city is the county. And in others, the county swallows dozens of cities. Elsewhere, like St. Louis, the city splits off from the county entirely. In fact, in most metro areas, you're paying both a city and a county government to do overlapping jobs. Public safety, roads, even public health. But it's not just confusing in theory, this stuff has real consequences. First, most people don't even know who does what. You call the city about a broken streetlight, they say it's a county road. You call the county and they say it's inside city limits. Round and round you go. Second, you end up with duplicate spending. 2 planning departments, 2 communications teams, 2 public works agencies doing the same thing, and no one held fully accountable when things go wrong. Third, metro-wide problems like housing, transportation, or public health, well, they fall through the cracks. There's no mandatory coordination. You're just hoping your elected officials can get along. This isn't just inconsistent, it's structurally illegible, even to the people who work inside it. We've gotten way far away from our concept of the library, haven't we? But that's civic word salad, a concept I've talked about in these other videos. And when taxpayers have no clear idea what they're actually buying with their tax dollars and who's really responsible when things go wrong, they start to feel ripped off. And honestly, who can blame them? It's kind of starting to feel like the lizard people are accomplishing their goals, isn't it? Well, the confusion created by civic word salad is a major structural problem in the US, and I'll come back to why that's so risky for us in a minute. But first, let's zoom out. Have you ever stopped to think that the way we do government in the US isn't the only way to do government? Well, the US isn't the only country with a federalist system, where you have a national government and some kind of subnational unit like a state, province, or canton. Countries like Germany, India, and Canada all use some version of federalism. And yes, in most of them, states or provinces have some flexibility in structuring local government the way they want. But here's the difference. Most of these countries have national frameworks that standardize how local government units are defined and organized. Take Germany, for example. It has 16 states, 3 of which are city-states, like Berlin or Hamburg, that operate a little bit differently, so set those aside. But while each state is free to set up its local governments the way they want, they basically all follow the same structure. Everything inside a state is divided into either a rural district or an urban district, which is just another way of saying city. A rural district contains many towns or smaller units known as municipalities. These municipalities handle day-to-day services like local roads, zoning, kindergartens, trash collection, and basic social support. But the rural district above them handles broader services like public transit, hospitals, and waste management, things that are more efficient to manage on a regional basis. Inside a municipality, you might have tiny villages or settlements, and they handle some simple local functions. But in general, there's a lot of right-sizing going on. On the other hand, an urban district is a large city, like Munich or Cologne, that handles both municipal and district-level responsibilities. It's pretty simple. It's taught to everybody in school, and most importantly, people generally understand who does what. But what is so very different about the US is the sheer amount of variation in local structures. The US practices something you could call extreme decentralization. Each state sets its own rules for how local governments are created and what local powers they have and how they're allowed to incorporate. And as a result, we don't just have 50 states, we have over 91,000 units of local government across those states. And that includes cities, towns, villages, boroughs, townships, school districts, sewer authorities, water boards, mosquito control districts, you name it. And every year we add more, especially in the fastest growing category, special purpose districts. And that's why it's so hard to know what anything is supposed to really cost in a given community. You could be paying 5 different agencies for some slice of the same type of service and still not really know who's in charge. Compared to countries like Germany, US local government looks haphazard, bloated, and expensive. And is it? Well, both countries spend about the same per person on government, around $30,000 each. But Germany does it with just 11,000 government units, and the US, 91,000 plus. Adjusted for population, we have twice as many government entities per person and nearly double the number of public workers per capita, even counting military and contractors. And what do Germans get for their money? Universal healthcare, subsidized childcare, a school system that ranks higher in math and science, and that doesn't rely on a zip code or the capacity of the local PTA to raise money to determine whether the school is going to have an arts program, decent facilities, or the resources to give a kid a shot at a good public education. Plus, they have a public sector that's simply easier to navigate with far less civic confusion. It's not just a different system, it's a more coherent one, where they're spending the same amount of money per person, but arguably delivering better public value in return. Now, I'm not saying we should just all go out there and copy Germany. There are many other ways to structure local government. Even countries like Canada and India, wildly different from one another, are often viewed as having simpler or more streamlined local frameworks than the US. But one thing is clear. We need our system to become more legible, coherent, and efficient. And that's going to be an uphill battle. Let me tell you one quick story. Long ago, I was at a meeting of the local Council of Governments in Ohio during a rollout of something called SkinnyOhio, a state-led initiative trying to save money by encouraging local governments to collaborate and co-purchase services. The idea was simple. Let 2 neighboring towns purchase and share one snowplow instead of each buying their own. State legislators even created a 1-page interlocal agreement to make it easier for them. But the room full of small-town mayors and village officials was skeptical. Why would they want to give up control of their plow? And of course, none of it was mandated. All the state could do was suggest and hope they follow along. Because in Ohio, as in many states, local control is king. And once you've created a separate bureaucracy, it's almost impossible to undo it, even when the financial logic is obvious. That meeting made it clear to me just how hard it is to change anything in a system built on fragmentation and turf. But sometimes the very thing that fragments us, like a special purpose agency with a focused mission, can also be key to solving a big problem. I went to work for one of them, King County Housing Authority in Washington State. It's one of the most economically efficient housing authorities in the country. Not only did it figure out how to house hundreds more families than expected using the same pool of federal funds, it also leveraged bond financing. So not tax dollars, but cheap debt, in a partnership with Amazon to acquire over 8,000 additional units of housing on the open market. Why? To hold that housing as a public asset, one that could be operated at cost by the housing authority, not to maximize profit, but so that in an area with skyrocketing rents, teachers, restaurant workers, and first responders could actually afford to live near the communities they serve and not a 2-hour drive away. That's pretty cool, right? And that's what happens when a government agency has clarity of mission, flexibility, and insulation from local politics. It's still public, but it's able to act more nimbly and solve real problems. So if we can have moments of real creativity and problem solving like that one, why is the rest of the system so hard to fix? Well, to answer that, I want to zoom out one more time, this time to history. Political scientist Francis Fukuyama makes a point that has always stuck with me. The most effective modern democracies didn't build their basic government systems from scratch after they became democratic. They inherited coherent, centralized bureaucracies from earlier regimes, monarchies, empires, authoritarian states, like the Prussian Empire in the case of Germany. Then democracy came later, layered on top of an already functional bureaucratic state, which was much easier to build when top-down control was the norm. But in the US, we did the opposite. We were founded in rebellion, not just against monarchy, but against centralized authority itself. We built democracy first, with deep local control, distributed power, and a healthy suspicion of big government. And while that's part of what makes the US dynamic and locally responsive, it also makes it fragmented, duplicative, and often incapable of acting efficiently at scale to solve regional problems. But let's come back to Civic Word Salad and why this problem isn't just about efficiency. You see, in the US, our whole system, at least in theory, rests on one idea: representation. When people don't understand what government is doing or why it's built the way it is, it creates a vacuum. And into that vacuum comes distrust, disinformation, manipulation, and even some conspiracy theories. You can't push for reform if you don't know what needs reforming. And you can't hold power accountable if you don't understand how power is structured in the first place. And you certainly can't advocate for good policy programs and services if you don't know what they look like. And that's what happens when US government is built like spaghetti, labeled in alphabet soup, and never really taught to us in a meaningful way. So are alien reptile people really infiltrating our institutions to keep us confused and angry? I don't really think so. But the truth might be harder to accept. We've built this confusion ourselves, and we've clung to it in the name of local control and rugged individualism. So our real challenge is going to be about finding a balance between the creativity and freedom we cherish and the discipline and consistency we need, so that what public goods you have access to don't differ so wildly based on where you happen to have been born. Our problems are bigger now, and our systems just aren't keeping up. And in the social sector, we talk a lot about systems change, but too often we mean programs. And the problem is the structure is producing the system. And unless we're willing to get right at the heart of the system, meaning the design of the US government, we're not really changing anything. Some people are worried we're headed towards a constitutional crisis. And honestly, I say bring it on. Because maybe what we need is a real conversation about structure, about what kinds of public goods everybody should have in this country, about what we can afford and how it should all work. I don't have all the answers, but I think it's time we stop treating structure like it's off limits. So if this got you thinking, hit subscribe and I'll see you on the next one.